He stepped away for just a few minutes. When he returned, he heard a strange thumping from the trunk. But when he opened it, what he saw flipped his life upside down. Staring back at him was a man with a gun and a backpack stuffed with cash. He had no idea the deadly game he was about to be dragged into. Christian had no reason to think this night would be any different. 34 years old, driving the same yellow cab through the dark streets of Chicago. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. But that night was about to show him just how wrong he was. It was supposed to be his last fare of the evening, a quick drop-off near a quiet cafe downtown. The passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, had left without a word. Christian pulled the car to the side, his stomach rumbling. He figured he had time for a quick stop. The dingy diner across the street had a bathroom, and he knew the staff wouldn't mind if he used it. He locked the doors, but he didn't pop the trunk. Why would he? The night was quiet, the streets half empty. He was only gone for 5 minutes, maybe less, but those 5 minutes were all it took to change his life forever. When Christian slid back into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life like any other night. But then he heard it, a dull thump from the back of the car. At first, he thought it was nothing. Maybe the suspension creaked or something shifted in the trunk. But then it happened again, louder this time. Thump. His heart started to race. He leaned forward, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The street was empty, bathed in the dim orange glow of flickering streetlights. No one was around. Thump. Shuffle. Christian's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. His mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe someone left something behind? A suitcase? But no, this wasn't the sound of luggage. It was different. He felt it in his gut. Something was wrong, very wrong. He pulled over to the side of the road, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment he just sat there, staring at the rearview mirror. His instincts screamed at him to drive, to ignore it. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, pulled him out of the car. The cold night air hit his face as he circled around to the trunk. The city sounds felt distant, muffled by the rapid beating of his heart. He reached for the trunk handle, his hand trembling. Click. The trunk popped open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, crammed inside the tight space, was a man in a black ski mask. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and in his right hand, he clutched a pistol, the barrel glinting under the streetlight. Next to him was a bulky backpack, its zipper stretched to the limit, with stacks of cash practically spilling out. The man's eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto Christian's. "Close the trunk and drive," the masked man hissed, his voice sharp and deadly. "Or you're dead." Christian couldn't believe what was happening. He was dragged into something deadly, but this was only the beginning. He thought he could just keep driving, and it would all be over. But with every mile, he sank deeper into the darkness. Then, the robber forced him to do something that turned everything upside down. Christian's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. His heart pounded louder than the hum of the engine, each beat echoing in his ears. The masked man's command still rang in his head. Close the trunk and drive. Felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The streets of Chicago stretched out in front of him, bathed in the cold glow of streetlights. He tried to focus on the road, pretending nothing was wrong, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should I drive to the police? Should I crash the car and hope for the best? But every idea ended with the same image. The cold barrel of that gun pointed at his head. Then it happened. A sudden, sharp thump from the trunk jolted him from his thoughts. It wasn't the same as before. This time it was deliberate. A warning. Thump, thump. Christian's breath quickened. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but the dark, empty streets offered no answers. He knew what the sound meant. The man wanted him to stop. Panic surged through him. For a split second, he considered ignoring it, pressing the gas, and driving until he found help. But what if the man shot through the trunk? What if he'd thought of that too? His foot, almost on its own, pressed down on the brake. The taxi screeched to a halt at the side of the road, tires skidding against the asphalt. The city seemed to hold its breath along with him. Christian sat frozen for a moment, his hands glued to the steering wheel. Maybe if I just sit here, he'll give up. But then another loud bang against the trunk shattered that hope. He had no choice. Christian stepped out of the car, the night air biting at his skin. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the back of the car. The streets were eerily quiet, amplifying every step he took. His hand hovered over the trunk latch, shaking uncontrollably. With a deep breath, he yanked it open. The man in the ski mask exploded out of the trunk like a coiled spring. In an instant he was standing, gun raised, eyes blazing with cold fury. Christian's heart nearly stopped. "Get in the car," the man hissed, his voice low and menacing. Now, Christian didn't argue. He stumbled back into the driver's seat, his pulse thundering in his ears. The man climbed into the back, slamming the door shut behind him. The smell of sweat and gunpowder filled the car, mixing with the faint scent of gasoline. The man kept the gun pointed at Christian's head, his knuckles white around the grip. "Drive. I'll tell you where to go." Christian swallowed hard and shifted the car into gear. As the taxi rolled forward, the man's voice cut through the tense silence. "And don't even think about playing hero. I'll know." The city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow. Christian's mind raced with every turn of the wheel. Where is he taking me? What happens when we get there? But he didn't dare ask. The only sound in the car was the rhythmic tapping of the man's finger against the trigger. After a few minutes, the man finally spoke. "Take the next left." Christian obeyed, his hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The streets grew darker, the city's heartbeat fading as they moved further from the downtown lights. The familiar hum of late-night traffic disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. "Keep going straight," the man ordered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if expecting someone to follow. "I'll let you know when to stop." Christian's throat was dry, his mind screamed for him to do something. Slam on the brakes, veer into a building, anything. But the gun's cold presence kept him frozen. He couldn't risk it. They drove deeper into the shadows, the streets narrowing and twisting. The buildings became older, more run down. Christian realized they were heading toward the industrial part of town, a place where no one would hear a gunshot. Suddenly, the man leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper in Christian's ear. "Turn off the headlights." Christian's breath hitched, but he did as he was told. The taxi plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from distant streetlights and the pale glow of the moon. The car felt like a coffin, sealing him in with his captor. For a few moments, they drove in silence, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Then, out of nowhere, the man barked, "Pull over." Now, Christian's heart slammed against his ribs as he guided the car to the side of the road. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. He didn't know what was about to happen, but every instinct screamed that it wouldn't be good. The man reached down, grabbed the heavy backpack from the floor, and unzipped it just enough for Christian to see the stacks of cash inside. The bills were bundled tightly, some stained with red dye from a security pack that must have gone off during the robbery. Christian's mouth went dry. "This is serious. This isn't just some petty thief. This is big." The man chuckled darkly, sensing Christian's fear. "You're in deep now, buddy," he muttered. "But don't worry. Play it smart, and you'll walk away from this." Christian couldn't believe what was happening. He was dragged into something deadly, but this was only the beginning. He thought he had everything under control, but the deeper they drove, the more he realized there was no way out of this alive. And when the robber finally spoke, his words made Christian wonder if it was time to risk everything. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror as Christian drove beyond the outskirts of Chicago. The road stretched into darkness, empty and silent, much like the cab's suffocating interior. The man in the ski mask, Travis, as Christian had learned, sat in the back seat, his gun resting loosely on his thigh, but his eyes never left Christian. They had been driving for nearly an hour, and in all that time Travis had said almost nothing. But the silence was worse than any threat. It filled the car with an unbearable tension, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Christian's mind raced. Where is he taking me? Every turn down an unfamiliar road felt like another nail in his coffin. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He stole quick glances in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch some sign of weakness in Travis, but all he saw was cold, calculated focus. Finally, just when the silence became too much to bear, Travis leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "I know you're scared," he said almost conversationally. "But I'm not gonna kill you. Not if you help me get out of here." Christian's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, offering a sliver of hope, but hope could be dangerous. Could he trust him? Or was this just another twisted mind game? Christian's throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. Where are we going?" Travis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a small, humorless chuckle. as if amused by Christian's attempt to regain control of the situation. "Someplace safe," he finally said. "For me, at least." The words hit Christian like a punch to the gut. For him, what did that mean for me? The car continued down an empty stretch of road, the landscape around them turning into a maze of abandoned warehouses and industrial lots. The city felt like a distant memory, swallowed by the darkness of the outskirts. It was the kind of place where people disappeared without a trace. Christian's mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe I can signal someone. Maybe I can crash the car and make a run for it. But every plan ended with the same terrifying image, Travis's gun, and the sound of a single shot. Then, as they approached a rusted gate leading to an old, crumbling factory, Travis finally spoke again. "Pin over. Right there." Christian did as he was told, bringing the car to a slow stop near the edge of the lot. The factory loomed in the distance, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. The place looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the ticking of the car's cooling engine and Christian's ragged breathing. Then Travis reached down, unzipped the backpack at his feet, and pulled out several thick stacks of cash. The bills were bound tightly, some still stained with red dye from the bank's security measures. He tossed them onto the passenger seat without a second glance. "That's for you," Travis said, his tone casual, as if they were old friends settling a debt. "For your help." Christian stared at the money, his mind struggling to process what was happening. It was more cash than he had ever seen in his life, enough to pay off his debts, maybe even start fresh somewhere far away. But it felt like the money was burning a hole in the seat, a physical weight pressing down on him. Travis leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't see me. You don't know me. You keep your mouth shut. And this is the last time we ever cross paths." Christian's mouth opened, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say. Was this really happening? Could it be that simple? Before he could find his voice, Travis opened the door and stepped out into the night. He slung the backpack over his shoulder and glanced back at Christian one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice low and deadly serious, "silence keeps you alive." With that, Travis disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the darkness surrounding the old factory. The sound of his footsteps faded until there was nothing but silence. Christian sat there, frozen. The car felt like a tomb, the stacks of cash on the seat beside him a silent, mocking reminder of the night's events. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. "It's over," he tried to convince himself. "He's gone. I'm safe." But deep down he knew better. The money might have bought his silence, but it couldn't buy peace. Every nerve in his body screamed that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Christian was left alone with the stack of money on the front seat. His heart was pounding. He thought it was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. He thought he was safe, but every minute after that only made the pressure worse. The money left by the robber became a burden he couldn't escape, and the worst was yet to come. Christian sat alone in his car, the stack of money still on the front seat. His heart pounded in his chest like it was trying to escape. The night was quiet now, too quiet. The sound of Travis's footsteps had faded into nothing, but the weight of his presence still lingered. For a few minutes, Christian just sat there, staring at the cash. Felt like a curse, a twisted reward for surviving something he shouldn't have been part of in the first place. He could leave it there, abandon it, pretend none of this ever happened. But his hands moved on their own. Before he even realized it, he'd stuffed the money into a bag and shoved it under the passenger seat. His mind raced with questions. What if someone saw us? What if the police are already looking for me? The thought of being dragged into this nightmare any further made his stomach churn. But deep down he knew it wasn't over. Not even close. By the time Christian pulled up to his apartment building, dawn was starting to creep over the horizon. The familiar streets of his neighborhood felt foreign, like he was seeing them through a different lens. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every passing car felt like it was following him. He parked in his usual spot, but before getting out he scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't calm him. If anything, it made him more paranoid. He grabbed the bag with the money, hesitated for a moment, then stuffed it into the trunk. Out of sight, out of mind, he told himself, but the pounding in his chest told a different story. Inside his apartment, the silence was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had. He dropped his keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch, but sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Travis's face, the gun, the money, and the fear. Hours passed. Christian tried to distract himself, turned on the TV, flipped through channels, but it was useless. Then it happened. A news alert flashed across the screen. Breaking news. Armed bank robbery shocks downtown Chicago. His blood ran cold as the reporter's voice filled the room. The suspect remains at large after a daring midday robbery at First National Bank. Police have released footage from nearby security cameras, showing what appears to be a getaway vehicle. A dark-colored taxicab spotted near the scene shortly after the robbery. Christian's breath caught in his throat. On the screen, grainy footage played, showing a taxi driving down a familiar street. It was fast, but there was no mistaking it. It was his car. He stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to think. The world around him blurred, but that image burned into his mind. They know. They're looking for me. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Christian barely left his apartment, afraid that every step outside would lead to his arrest. Every time he heard a siren in the distance, his heart raced. Every knock on the door made his breath hitch in his throat. He checked the news constantly, waiting for updates, dreading the moment his name would be mentioned. But nothing came. The police were still searching for the robber, but no suspects had been named. Yet, the money was still in his trunk, a constant reminder of that night. He thought about getting rid of it, burning it, dumping it somewhere, anything to make it disappear. But fear kept him frozen. What if it's marked? What if they trace it back to me? The possibilities gnawed at him, each one worse than the last. One night, unable to take the silence any longer, Christian went for a drive. The streets were quiet, but his mind was anything but. He drove aimlessly, hoping the motion would calm his nerves, but it only made things worse. Every car that pulled up behind him felt like a tale. Every glance from a pedestrian felt like suspicion. As he drove past the bank, he couldn't help but slow down. The place was still surrounded by police tape, the windows boarded up. It looked like a crime scene from a movie, but this wasn't fiction. He was part of this now, part he couldn't escape. Back at home, the weight of the situation finally broke him. Christian sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands, the fear and guilt crashing over him like a wave. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every moment felt like he was waiting for something, waiting for the knock on the door, for the sirens outside his window, for the inevitable consequences of that night. The pressure was unbearable. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He thought staying silent would save him, but the truth weighed more than money. And when he finally decided to go to the police, he had no idea the real reckoning was still ahead. Christian sat in his apartment, staring at the envelope filled with cash sitting on his kitchen table. The weight of the money felt heavier than it had a week ago. It wasn't just paper. It was a reminder of everything he'd been dragged into. Every glance at it sent a shiver down his spine. He thought the fear would fade with time. Didn't. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder his guilt screamed. Every siren outside, every knock on the neighbor's door felt like it was meant for him. The tension was unbearable. Sleep was impossible, and every waking moment was consumed by the same thought: I have to come clean. Finally, after a sleepless night, Christian made his decision. He grabbed the envelope, shoved it into his jacket, and headed for the police station. His hands trembled the entire drive. His mind raced with scenarios. Would they believe me? Would they think I was involved? But the one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't live like this anymore. Walking into the police station felt like stepping into a furnace. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the air too thin. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the front desk, where a stern-looking officer glanced up at him. "I need to report something," Christian said, his voice shaky. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. Instead, he gestured toward a small interview room. "Wait in there. Someone will be with you shortly." Christian sat alone, staring at the blank walls, his pulse thundering in his ears. Minutes felt like hours before two detectives finally entered the room. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, and the other was shorter, with a notebook already in hand. "I'm Detective Harris," the tall one said, taking a seat across from Christian. "This is Detective Monroe. You said you needed to report something?" Christian nodded, his throat dry. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope, placing it on the table. "I was involved, but not how you think," he started. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words tumbled out in a rush after that. He told them everything, from the moment he heard the thump in his trunk to the night Travis left him with the money. Every detail, every fear, spilled out like a confession. When he finished, the room fell into silence. The detectives exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Detective Harris leaned forward, his eyes locked on Christian. "Why did you wait so long to come in?" Christian swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "Because I was scared, because I thought ignoring it would make it go away," but all he managed to say was, "I didn't know what to do." Harris nodded slowly, as if considering his answer. Monroe jotted something down in his notebook, but neither of them spoke for a long, heavy moment. Then Harris reached for the envelope, opening it carefully. He pulled out one of the stacks of bills and examined it. Almost immediately, his jaw tightened. "These bills are marked," Harris said, his tone flat. "We've been tracking them since the robbery." Christian's stomach dropped. "Marked?" The word echoed in his mind, bringing a fresh wave of panic. He thought turning in the money would clear his name, but now it felt like he was sinking even deeper. The detectives excused themselves, leaving Christian alone in the small, sterile room. The minutes dragged by like hours. Every second felt like a lifetime, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Are they going to arrest me? Do they think I'm involved? When the door finally opened again, Detective Harris's face was colder than before. "We're going to need you to stay here for a bit longer," he said. "We have some questions about your involvement." "Involvement?" Christian repeated, his voice rising with panic. "I told you everything. I didn't know what was happening until it was too late." Harris didn't flinch. "That's what everyone says." Christian's heart pounded. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He thought coming forward would ease his guilt, give him a way out. But now it felt like he was walking into a trap. The detectives left again, and Christian's mind spiraled. He thought about calling a lawyer, but he didn't even know where to start. What if they really think I'm part of this? What if Travis set me up from the beginning? The realization hit him like a freight train. What if this was the plan all along? Travis had left him the money, knowing it was marked. He'd used Christian as a scapegoat, a way to throw the police off his trail. Christian felt sick. The room spun around him as the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. He thought he was doing the right thing, but now it felt like he was deeper in trouble than ever before. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. This time, Harris and Monroe were accompanied by another officer, who carried a folder in his hand. They sat down and Harris slid the folder across the table toward Christian. "Do you recognize this man?" Harris asked, opening the folder to reveal a photo. Christian's blood ran cold. It was Travis, but not the Travis he'd met in his cab. This was a mugshot, complete with a list of charges beneath it: armed robbery, assault, and now murder. "Murder?" Christian's voice was barely a whisper. Harris nodded grimly. "We found a body last night. We believe it's connected to the robbery, and to your friend Travis." Christian's world crumbled around him. Murder? He'd thought he was just an unlucky bystander in a robbery. But now it was so much worse. "We need to know everything," Harris continued. "Anything you left out. This isn't just about the money anymore." Christian felt the walls closing in. He tried to focus, to recall every detail, but his mind was foggy with fear. Murder. The word echoed in his head like a death sentence. He spent hours in that room, answering questions, going over every second of that night. But no matter how much he told them, he could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe he was innocent, not completely. When they finally let him leave, the sun was setting outside, but the freedom felt hollow. The weight of what had happened and what was still to come was suffocating. Back in his apartment, Christian sat in the dark, staring at the walls. The fear hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. The police knew his name now. They knew his face. And somewhere out there, Travis was still free. The knock on his door later that night nearly gave him a heart attack. But it wasn't the police. It was a plain envelope, slipped under his door. No name, no address. Inside was a single note, written in messy, hurried handwriting. "You talk, you die." Christian stared at the words, his hands shaking. He thought going to the police would end this. He thought doing the right thing would save him. But he was wrong. He thought he was safe, but the truth pulled him deeper. Some decisions change your life forever.